Music therapist Amanda Thorpe, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm really happy to have you here. You had reached out to me as a listener. One of the things you let me know was that you're a longtime listener who listened to hundreds of episodes, which of course I'm very gratified to learn that.
Mm.
But you wrote to let me know that you felt there was a hole in my offering because I didn't have any music therapists, and so I wrestled with that a little bit and realized, well, I think you're right. So I wrote back to you and saying, well, how about you? And you said because you in your initial email had suggested a couple of names that people who I guess were major figures in the field. And I said, how about you? And you said, well, I haven't written a book. And I let you know, well, you don't have to have written a book to be on the show. I've had other people who have not written books, even though as things have evolved over the years, it's just been easy, I guess, to go with authors. There is a certain kind of authority, I guess, that comes with having written a book. And but I said, no, I was persistent. I really felt like I wanted to go with you. And now I feel like there was some higher wisdom or something in that because I, you had mentioned that you were a performer in your bio. And I thought, well, maybe I can find her performing on YouTube. I'd like to see what she looks like, sounds like, etc. And I found you on YouTube and I was absolutely enchanted by you as a performer. Uh, some of the, and I'll put a link to this for our listeners and viewers because I really think they need to discover you in that way. And saw you singing with a band. I guess was that your band? Were you like that? Were you just performing
I
with
had
the band, or was it your band?
it depends which video you were looking at. I have been in a couple of bands. The two main ones that I've been in was the Wirebirds,
Yeah, that's the one I
which
saw.
was a quintet in New York, and then I had a duo group in New York again with another English chap who was over there.
Yeah. Well, that was another thing that intrigued me that I discovered in our email and in what I could find about you online was that you've been in the U.S. a bunch. You've been in New York. You've been in France, and I thought this is a really interesting woman, and I like her musical sense of the kind of music that she seems to be drawn to, which some of it was maybe a bit quirky. I discovered something that was written about you. It seemed like it would have been from liner notes or something like that. And it read Amanda Thorpe, English girl, formerly in New York, then Paris, now back in England, is a music therapist and recording artist. She writes and performs wistful, moody songs rooted in the English folk tradition, though she remains a restless, eclectic musician, effortlessly blending elements of jazz, cabaret, Americana, and electronics to serve her themes of dislocation, longing, and loss, touched with humor, hope, and anticipation. Well, I just found that terribly attractive.
I'll have to thank whoever wrote it. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
yeah. I
But,
thought, okay, this is like uh, I'm thinking of some of the wonderful girl singers back in the days of folk music that uh, that I felt very drawn to, although it wasn't necessarily going to be mutual. Um, so yeah, there are songs that you perform with your young son at
Mm.
various ages. How old is he now?
He's 12 now.
And what's his
So
name?
Spencer.
Spencer.
Spencer. Hmm.
And he is quite a character actually, and
Yes.
you're sort of like his straight man in these. You're there and you're just doing the guitar, and you're like the straight man, and he's kind of a little bit of a card. So
Yes, he
it'll
is.
be
Yes.
interesting to see how he turns out, and maybe he'll be on the show at some point.
That would be
Uh,
lovely. I'm sure he'd rise to the occasion.
Yeah, and a couple of the songs that you sang that really touched me that I was familiar with somewhat were "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" and "Strange Fruit" by Billie Holiday.
Mm.
And I believe you got to know the composer of "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime," which is this
Not the
what?
composer. Composer Yip Harburg. It has left us, but his family. I worked with his family in New York and did some work with children of the Lower East Side, which was a sort of music theatre program that the Yip Harburg Foundation supported, because I think in his will he wanted to bring music and education to children of the Lower East Side, which was where he had grown up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what a wonderful opportunity to get to know that family somewhat. And "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" This wonderful song from the Depression years, I
Mm.
think. And somehow I relate to it, even though I wasn't alive during those years. But it's just it touches universal themes.
Well,
And
I
I
think
thought
that's
it
one
was
of the
maybe
things about Yip. If you look at Yip's, because the album that is from is it's all songs of Yip Harburg's lyrics that I then either changed the music to or changed the arrangements to. But his lyrics are so sort of socially conscious and provocative and questioning. And when you think about the time that he was actually writing those lyrics, he was really sort of pushing people to address major issues, you know, whether it was women's liberation or whether it was race issues, capitalism, whatever it
yeah.
was. You know, he was really trying to sort of force these issues into the public sphere in a gentle way in which people were not sort of you know, too scared of. You know, I think it was like that
Yeah.
slow burn where things sort of seeped in and then you sort of have a realization about what he's actually saying.
I thought maybe I had learned that song during my folk years, but then I realized no, I was actually confusing it with another song that has a similar sentiment. Nobody knows you when you're down and out,
Mm-hmm.
and "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" I discovered Tiny Tim, who
Mm-hmm.
was known for the very high pitched voice. Uh, reviving these songs from the 20s, and it was amazing to hear him singing in a sort of full-throated adult voice. Have you heard his version of "Buddy, Can You Spare a Dime"?
You know, I most probably did because I listened to so many versions of it when I was doing that album, and so I can't, you know, there's so
Yeah.
many
Well, it's
different, you
on
know, because
YouTube.
I
It's on
should go back
YouTube.
and listen to it again. I
Yeah.
should.
Yeah. I've been tempted to, I don't know why I haven't done it, but I'm hoping that maybe that was one song on an LP or something, that there'd be a whole bunch of songs that he did in that other kind of voice and
Mm.
maturity. Uh, yeah, so many exciting things to explore in terms
Mm.
of our musical journeys. And I was so fascinated with you and your journey that I wanted to invite you to take us through the chapters of your life, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
as if it were a book. And so I assume you you grew up in the UK. What sort of a family were you born into? Tell us a bit about
So back in the beginning, I
that.
was born under what I would think was most probably a restless and wandering star, because I have been quite a restless spirit, I think. I was the youngest of three children. It was a fairly traditional middle class family. We lived in the middle of England, so it was a landlocked area of England, and we were right on the periphery of the city one way and the countryside the other way.
Uh-huh.
So it was, looking back on it, it was idyllic. It's like I had the best of
Yeah.
both worlds.
Yes.
And I did spend many a day sort of walking in the moors of Derbyshire and the sort of dales of Derbyshire, sort of having these sort of epiphanial moments of
Yeah.
um, feeling at one with nature. We have
Uh-huh.
stone circles up in Derbyshire. It's a sort of
Mhm.
Neolithic area. And went to school, wasn't the best of students. I don't know whether if they had put me through a battery of tests, maybe I would have had some kind of diagnosis. Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe I was just being an adolescent. But I was not quite a straight arrow in terms of
Yeah, well, it's
education.
clear from what you said that you were following your own wandering star, and
Mm.
uh, so I would say you had an inner genius that was calling to you and
Yeah.
leading you elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And was it a musical family that you were born into?
Um, well, my father was a businessman and my mother was a French teacher. But there's also a huge love of music. So my father was always listening to music. Whenever we went on holiday, the cassettes that had to be taken in the car were,
Ah,
extensive, and we'd cycle through, country and western and big band jazz and old traditional jazz. And then every now and then my mum would get her classical cassette in, and then we'd be back onto the
yeah.
country and western. My father also played the harmonica and my mother played the piano. So, we had a house of pets and pianos and instruments, and but
Yeah, it sounds very rich and good family trips. It sounds like I grew up in a house where there were 78s, I guess they were called 78.
mm-hmm,
My parents had these great uh, record collection,
mm-hmm,
and I wish I had it today.
mm-hmm,
But it was a mixed marriage, so my dad was black, my mother was white, and but they had a lot of sort of classic black artists, the Ink
mm-hmm.
Spots,
Oh, that
and
my dad loved the ink spots
yeah, the
or the
Ink Spots
platters.
and
Yeah.
Nat King Cole and
Mm-hmm,
old stuff like that. So I got exposed to a lot of that kind of music. But getting back to the chapters of your book,
mm-hmm.
what's the next chapter?
I studied in London. Somehow or other, I managed to get some results and exams together, and then I got into University College of London and studied psychology. And I had a trip over to Padua in Italy to study neuropsychology, which was great, apart from the fact it was all in Italian and I didn't speak Italian. So quite an interesting experience. Um, and then after graduating, I had a free ticket to use an aeroplane ticket. And so I got on a plane and I flew to New York, and I just didn't use the return ticket. So I got kind of stuck in New York and remained there, got a job working in the Bronx Psychiatric Hospital. and did a couple of years doing employment training and counseling with individuals, and then decided that I was not mature enough or capable of working in that environment at that time for whatever reason. I mean, it was also incredibly poorly paid. So I got a different job, and then I was having these bands. So I started doing a lot of visa hopping, to stay in America. So I was quite dependent on various jobs
Uh-huh.
that I could get to get the visas. And then I had my bands. And so the bands were very active in
So
the
it's
late
quite a mixed
90s.
life. On the one hand, you were being a bit of an academic in terms of
Mm-hmm.
getting degrees and your interest in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
What drew you to psychology? What did I
Oh, I think it was, the existential crisis that one has when they're like 13, and the sort of emotional derailment of just not knowing how to navigate things. And so then you start reading books, and there was like the Alan Watts books that I would read about the wisdom of insecurity, and started getting interested in Freud. And then of course Oliver Sacks was another
oh yeah.
book that I read when I was very young. And so I decided I wanted to be a therapist, or an architect, but I'd already decided I couldn't be an architect because my math wasn't very good. So
Uh,
psychology seemed like a better option. And like a good wounded healer, you want to go and sort of be a therapist, because I think everybody on the psychology course was busy trying to understand themselves
yes,
rather than
yeah.
sort of study
I always resisted
psychology.
that idea. I
Um,
hated it when people
mm,
professors who are not clinically oriented would roll that out, and I just
mm,
resisted it. In hindsight, though, in
mm,
hindsight, I can see that that was very much true for me, and here I am,
mm,
interviewing people across the world of psychotherapy and all, and
mm,
so evidently it was a deeply rooted need that I've ended up spending so much of my
yeah,
adult life here in
mm,
psychology. I was reluctant to call myself a psychologist in my young adult years, because
mm.
people would react and say, "Oh, I'll bet you're analyzing me now," but in fact, I was not.
Yeah, that was fairly common. Yeah.
Yeah, that didn't wasn't my personality to do that really.
And I think in England there was, you know, always been a huge stigma around psychology and therapy and things like that. So of course, when I was in New York, it was far more accessible, and like everybody had a therapist that I knew in New York. And so
Yeah,
it sort of changed my relationship with what it was all about as well. And sort of feeling at that point that um, it was all right if I had a therapist too. It wasn't like
yeah,
this weird sort of abnormal thing that I was
yeah.
doing.
Was there a time when you hoped you were going to make it big in music so that you could support yourself entirely and that you discovered you couldn't do that, or what was the deal? Because it's such a competitive
Yes, of
area.
course. Yeah. Yes, I certainly wanted to make my living being a musician, and I am,
Yeah,
which is you know um I love writing and I love performing, and I hate self promotion, and I think you need to have a huge
a huge ego.
drive, an
Yeah,
ability to self promote, to be able to keep going forward. And
yeah, those are the ones who make it
I
big, right? I certainly
yeah, if
have
you're a bit
some of the.
quiet,
Yeah,
then it's rather hard to keep selling yourself and sort of saying, oh, but I'm
yeah,
great. It's sort
yeah,
of it's an unnatural thing for me to do. But in terms of loving it, absolutely. I love being on the stage and performing and feeling like people are getting something out of it is
Right. Yeah.
special.
Yeah. 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 Me too. I guess that's part of being a professor for me, was being an entertainer. Really, that was maybe the you know part of it that really resonated for
It's
me.
funny because I was thinking in one of your other podcasts, you talk about the fact that you're quite introverted, and
Yeah.
then you put yourself in this position where you're being quite extroverted. And I think that when I perform, I'm looking quite extroverted, but I think ultimately I'm a bit more introverted than.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, I can really relate to that. And somewhere, I don't know if it was in your bio or something that you put in one of your notes to me, was that when you were in New York, somebody suggested to you, well, what about music therapy? You could do that. And
It was actually the heart.
your reaction at the time
Oh,
was,
no, 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 no! Can't possibly do that. It was
what?
actually the Harburgs, the Harburg family, who um, had engaged me to do some, various projects, and they. I think one of the reasons why they did engage me was because they didn't want to have a music therapist. They wanted somebody who is like a little less therapy informed to do a lot of the work,
Yeah,
but also using music and using songwriting in um, a, a sort of educational learning and capacity. And then I went to see some Nordorf Robin lessons at NYU because I was thinking, oh, should I do this or not? And I was just like, no way, can't, not interested. The noise, there's too much noise. It's a cacophony, and I that's not what I want to do. I'm a musician. I'm a performer. I'm a songwriter, and that's different. So I put it off. And in retrospect, of course, I wish I'd done it years ago because it's amazing work. I'm thoroughly enjoying
yeah,
the
yeah.
work, and
Tell
it
us a
feels
bit
so meaningful.
about music therapy and what it is today. It's not that old a profession, right? I think maybe began
So it's
in the late 50s as a profession.
as a formalized profession. Yes, I think it was in the 50s. So prior to that, I think music, Plato wrote about the influence of music and harmony on the soul and the being and a state of well-being. So there's a humongous amount of writing from the Greek philosophers about
Mm.
what different pentatonic scales or Dorian scales will do to your internal state, and always talking about this balance and harmonic sort of being. Then in the 1920s, I think it was, when there were a lot of soldiers, veterans, after coming home from World War One, who had been exposed to a lot of music, and the doctors were starting to observe how it sort of lifted their spirits, changed their mood. And so then it started to become formally included into hospitals as a therapeutic activity. So I think this is where the sort of challenge lies, is lots of things can be therapeutic and beneficial, but then the formalization of music therapy as a profession is quite different, because you're actually training somebody to be a therapist, a psychodynamic therapist, who will then work within the construct of therapy, but using music as the tool.
Yeah,
So
and
in the
I was
50s,
impressed by your bio where you list some of the trainings that have been part of your preparation, and there's a lot of attention to neurology and the brain and all of that, and that really came clear to me. You sent me a paper that you'd written. You haven't written a book, you were despairing. Well, I don't have a book, but I have to tell you, the paper that you sent with me would make a great first chapter of a book. And if you have other case histories that you've written, I bet they could be organized into a book. I would
Ah,
encourage you to do
that's very
that.
good.
Yeah,
Okay.
really,
And then you'll
really.
have to interview me again.
Yeah, I'll be happy to interview you again to talk about that book. So,
Yeah.
that case history was very educational for me, even though it's not terribly long. But thank goodness, because but
Mm.
it was compact, and and I was so impressed by the specificity of your neurological knowledge and expertise and the way that you coordinated the therapeutic interventions. And share that case with us if you would. And you're also a little playful in the title, called a space oddity, was it? Space,
Mm-hmm.
is that right?
Yes. Space Oddity, as in the David Bowie Space Oddity song. So that
Okay,
was a
yeah.
song that we used in our therapy sessions very frequently. So just before I get specifically into the case study, so the training to be a music therapist in the UK, I'm not sure about in the US, but in the UK, it's at a master's level and you're basically learning child development, psychological theories and constructs. You are learning about psychodynamic application of therapy interactions, group theory beyond. We learn about Winnicott, etc. So when
That's
we
a
come
lot.
out,
That's a whole lot.
it is a lot. It's
Yeah.
very intense, and you do your own psychotherapy as well. That's a requirement of the training. So we have years of psychotherapy, and at the same time we're learning about the psychodynamic process because we look at the relationship in the sessions through the music, through the lens of the music. So it's like rather than having the third eye, it's the third ear, where you're listening to the communication that is coming through the way in which somebody is playing, whether it's the rhythm or the tempo or the sort of abrupt ending or the disruptive or the sort of cacophony or you're continually sort of evaluating what is fundamentally happening with inside that person, how they're responding to things. So after the training, you don't have to study neurologic music therapy, but there is a very specific
Uh-huh.
training in neurologic music therapy, which I think more and more people are doing now, because of course there's been far more advances in neuroimaging and the understanding of how music is
Right.
influencing the brain and what
Yeah.
it's doing. And so there's a professor up, he was originally based in Colorado, Michael Tout and Corrine Tout. They've now moved to Canada, and they're in Toronto, and they have created 20 very specific neurologic music therapy techniques that are founded in research. They've all been verified and tested and replicated. So these are techniques that they know can work with
Wow.
specific situations. They've
Yeah.
got a protocol that you follow, and the goal is to really find the way to then remove the music. We're trying to the holy grail is the removal of the music, so somebody's not dependent on music to walk better or talk better or improve their attention and these different areas in which those neurologic music therapy
Yeah.
techniques are used. So moving into the Space Oddity case study, this was a gentleman who had had a stroke and he had expressive aphasia, so he knew exactly what he wanted to say. He just couldn't get the words out. When I first met him, could barely say hello without a lot of prompting and a lot of mirroring and looking at the way in which you were sort of initiating the speech. So a couple
Yeah.
of techniques that we use is it's called music speech stimulation technique. It's very similar to what speech and language therapists use, where you say a very common phrase and you expect them to drop the last word of the phrase in. So Mary had a little, you're
Yeah.
supposed to say lamb now,
It
but you
happened. It
didn't.
happened in my mind, believe me.
Excellent. Okay. So things like that, where, the person that you're working with, you started pulling the thought so the word will come out. And then with singing, you choose very familiar songs, and it's My Bonnie Light Over the
Ocean.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
See.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
trainable. You've got a good working memory.
Yeah.
So, we started working on this sort of speech stimulation, trying to pull words, and then we'd sort of build backwards. So rather than My Bonnie Lies Over the, it would then be My Bonnie Lies Over, and then hopefully he would be able to say the
Yeah.
ocean, etc. So, of
Uh,
course,
One
to
of the
do
things
things.
that grabbed me in this case history was that you inquired into who was his favorite musical artist, and you discovered that David Bowie was really up there for him. And so you built
Absolutely.
these sorts of exercises off of David Bowie songs and
Mm-hmm.
had him, I guess, tapping rhythms some of the
Mm-hmm.
time on one side of the body or the other, and a whole
Mm-hmm.
graduated. One of the issues for him was his gait, as often
Mm-hmm.
happens with people who've had a stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was intrigued to see that you were able to work on gait
Mm-hmm.
by working with the brain in certain ways, not necessarily practicing walking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, say a little, fill that out a little bit for me here.
So, definitely it's like that rhythmic entrainment that you're looking for, and the way in which the brain is using rhythm to anticipate movement. So the motor cortex will get engaged when you've got a really clear, steady
Yeah,
beat. The brain's looking at the whole and anticipating when the action happens. So everything's getting primed for the action with those rhythmic cues. So those are things that we would use for when he was walking and practicing his walk. Just having, you sort of have to make sure that it's not too fast and not too slow, so that there is a sort of natural fluency with his walking. It's actually a technique that's used very specifically with people with Parkinson's, because they have slightly different walking pattern to somebody with a stroke, who may have like severe one-sided sort of weakness or immobility. But what you're trying to do is help them move and have everything sort of fired up in the brain to facilitate that movement as fluidly and smoothly as possible. So you need to know what the natural rhythmic gait is of that person, so they're not suddenly sort of speeding up and tripping over, or going so slow that it's awkward and uncomfortable. So there's
yeah.
a lot of sort of pre-measurement and timing and using of metronomes to make sure that we're doing something that is going to really help and facilitate that movement for them.
Yeah. I'm remembering this film that was very popular. I'm sure you know it. I can never remember the name of it, where in an old folks home they put
Alive Inside.
yeah, Alive Inside, that's the title. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And these people came to life because they had maybe hadn't spoken in years,
Mm-hmm.
and but they put in the songs that they had grown up with, say, in their
Mm-hmm.
teen years,
Mm-hmm.
and big smiles came on their
Mm-hmm.
faces, and that was just such a remarkable. thing. And somehow that ties in, I think, with the work that
Mm-hmm.
you're doing.
Well, I think if you think about the sort of development of the fetus, and hearing's like the first sense to really develop before you're even born. So already you're sort of being auditorily entrained to notice things, and then you start hearing the mother's voice. Then you start feeling the mother's footstep, and like a little baby will be able to turn and recognize their mother's footstep coming down the
Wow.
hall and
Yeah.
look around, hear that. Then the mother's voice is so critically important, or the caregiver's voice is really important in that sort of child's development and the evolution of expression and understanding, and the sort of melodic exaggeration that is used when people talk to young children, babies, is because they have to communicate intention and meaning, and the baby has to understand intention and meaning without understanding the words. Can't remember where I
Yeah.
was going with this, but
And the mother's heartbeat
mm-hmm.
is probably one of the first things that we all hear, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
And
very
so,
rhythmically
yeah.
sort of sounding. Oh, I
And
was thinking about the songs that we listen to. So the, nursery rhymes, or the um lullabies, and it's all sort of holding and containing the child in a manner that will provide safety and
yeah,
security. And then as we start to grow up, the amount of music that's around us all the time, subliminally sort of going into our non-conscious minds, but then how our musical selections start to identify us, and how we become, you know who we are is sort of represented through the music that we listen to, the way we dress, the way we express ourselves. And so music again just becomes so key to that sort of whole growth.
yeah,
So then on the other end of the scale, when somebody's sort of on the decline, the sort of outer parts, the higher level functioning, is decreasing, but the sort of fundamental sort of emotional base
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
is still there. So then when those emotional cues go in, then it sort of fires up different things. But music again, it activates so many different parts of the brain simultaneously, which is why it can be used in so many different ways.
Yeah, I'm still with the mother's heartbeat, and and thinking that there's probably no culture in which drumming was not present,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Hugely important, and drumming
Yeah,
is actually one of the things that um, was key to I did a program with the blue light services in a area south of London, and so blue light, the emergency ambulance, fire, police services, so high stress position jobs, sort of running into danger. So a lot of blue light personnel suffer significantly with anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress. And we put together a program for them where I did 12 weeks of musical improvisation with a group, and drumming was fundamentally part of that group.
yeah,
And they all came in going, God, what on earth have I signed up for? And they all left going, that was the best thing since sliced bread, It's like,
yeah, yeah,
it was a really, really powerful experience for them, that was wonderful, because, and it was also, something that they all really didn't think that they were, they didn't, again, that perception of music therapy and what is it, one of the participants was like, oh, I thought it was going to be a bit of a come by our session, and we'd all sit around, singing songs, and
yeah,
it's totally different to that. It's a structured group therapy session.
yes,
Fundamental is drumming, because again, the drumming is something that can sort of almost immediately pull a group together with a
Yeah.
common entrainment, and through that shared rhythm, it's amazingly powerful.
What's on your own cutting edge these days? What is it that you are, if anything, is there something you're moving toward or wanting to integrate into your work or take things in a different direction?
um I mean, I love the integration of the neurological music therapy with the psychodynamic, because I think the non-verbal sort of mental health um, aspects are just fascinating, and more intriguing in a way. The neurologic music therapy, it is what really sort of inspired me to finally go into music therapy.
Yeah.
And now I sort of feel like my professor would most probably be like dumbfounded for me to say, no, I'm really, really back into the psychodynamic, psychotherapeutic aspects of
Yeah.
things and understanding that. And I find the um, the sound therapy, the use of sound vibrations, curious. I don't know exactly where I land on it in that level, but I had a recent engagement with craniosacral therapy, and I found that fascinating, and the whole discussion
What
around
was it again?
energy.
What kind of therapy?
Craniosacral therapy.
Cranial sacral. Yes, I've heard of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And so it's a lot about the transference of energy, and I just found that like the um I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I found it really interesting, and I found the movement and the sort of the description of how the transference of energy between patient and therapist sort of helps the body become primed for self-healing, really fascinating, and made
Uh-huh.
a lot of
Yeah.
sense. And I suppose that sort of also leads into that sort of idea of homeostasis. And I've just been quite curious about where homeostatic ideas fit into therapy as well. I don't
Yeah.
know whether that
Yeah.
makes any sense, but that's what I'm sort of playing with in my
Okay.
mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Where was I just going to go? Oh, one of the places I've sort of meant to explore more in terms of the interviews is there are people, the music is playing a big part in psychedelic psychotherapies,
Mm.
psychedelic assisted psychotherapies. And so I think there are people who are on the cutting edge of trying to figure out what the specificity would be in terms of what kind of music is needed at what
Mm.
particular stage. And
Well, there are certainly like lots of different, I've been working on a trachea ventilator, mechanical ventilation unit recently. And again, like, mechanical ventilation is highly anxiety producing, and when you wean people off tracheas and mechanical ventilation, incredibly stressful and nervous sort of experience that a lot of the patients go through.
well,
And there are quite a few papers that talk about this real sort of specific sort of categorization of musical style, not styles so much, but number of instruments, complexity of harmonic structure, and reducing the categories of music down to this totally relaxed state. Because a bit like we were talking about earlier, where there's the entrainment with the body and the movement, it's also quite possible that it can affect your breathing and your heart. So you can either ramp people up or you can pull them down in a sort of very sort of unintrusive manner to help
Yeah.
regulate. So I would imagine that with the psychedelics, there's going to be a lot of people looking at sort of number of instruments, complexity of harmonic structure, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. You've in your career and your interests, you've been able to meet some fascinating people. One of whom is a major figure in neuroscience, Joseph Ledoux,
Mm-hmm.
who also has a band. He did a lot of work on
Yeah.
the amygdala and on fear.
Amygdaloid. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he's got a group called the Amygdaloids, and
Mm-hmm.
I gather you've sung, played with them.
Yes, so I was the bass player in the Amygdaloids for 3 years. I think 3 years, yeah. And
You
so
were
we
the
wrote
bass player.
together. I was the bass
Uh-huh.
player, yes. And
Wow.
we still write together remotely. And whenever I'm in New York or he's in London, then we try and get together to do something. Um, so yeah,
That's great.
he's
And you
fabulous.
fixed, I interviewed him about 10 years ago, and about his neuropsychological work, which was very important in memory reconsolidation.
Mm-hmm.
And but he mentioned that he had a band and he was into music, and it felt like that's really what he wanted to talk about more than
He loves
more
his
than
music. He's
more,
a like
yeah,
prolific songwriter,
yeah. And so
prolific all round actually.
you've hooked me up with him again. You suggested that it might be interesting to interview him again, and I thought, well, I'm not sure he would remember me. It was the Wise Counsel podcast rather than Shrink Wrap Radio, but we've now exchanged a couple of emails thanks to you. We've set a date. It's going to happen, and hopefully you'll hear it, and hopefully it'll live up to your.
I'm sure I will.
Yeah, yeah. Or maybe I ought to have you in on that, actually. That would be an interesting thought.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we
We
might
just
think about that.
recorded a song whilst I was just recently in New York, and it was a lovely song. It went through my head. I did some backing vocals on it, and it has just been continually coming back into my brain, which is I love it when you sort of get a wormhole song. It's means it's a good song.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we've come pretty much to the end of the stuff that we wanted to cover here, or that I wanted to cover. And is there anything else that you would like to say that we didn't get in here?
No, I just really appreciate the forum and the opportunity to talk about music therapy, because I know that you do talk a lot about music with a lot of your people that you have interviewed, and so I know that there's not the void of music per se in your podcasts. It was the lack of the music therapist that I was
Yeah,
was feeling was the whole. But I love hearing people talking about music that are from all different disciplines, because it is an incredibly powerful and fundamental part of our lives. So I just, as I say, I appreciate the forum for being able to shine a light on music therapy, and hope that more people
yeah.
can access it, because it makes such a difference for so many people. We just need to get more funding.
Yeah, I'm a frustrated musician. I mean, if I am lucky enough to get reborn, reincarnated,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be right at the top of the list of to really get the skills, because I feel like there's music in my soul, and but I didn't develop the skills early enough to have the ability to be the inner musician that I feel is there. but there have been situations where with other musicians who were understanding and willing to kind of come down to my level
Mm.
that were just transcendent for me, and where uh, I was able to do things that felt way beyond my ability.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yes,
don't know.
it's a,
I
lovely
don't
to
know.
play with people who
Yeah.
can, pull you up, which is
Yes. Yes. And
beautiful.
so I've had that experience, and it was just a wonderful experience.
Mm.
So we could go on and on here,
Mm.
but well, we're going to wrap it up. Music therapist and soul sister, I would say, Amanda
Thank you.
Thorpe. Thanks for being my guest on Shrink Wrap Radio, and look forward to talking about your book when it comes out, and who
Oh,
knows what else will come our way.
excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Likewise.